Welcome to another episode of the Naked Christian Podcast. I'm Beresford Job, your host and your guide, as we're on our meander through the maze of biblical truth. But here's the shtick, okay? We won't be dressing the difficult bits up to make them more acceptable. We won't be getting the bits that lots of Christians sadly don't like. We won't be taking them and then clothing them in compromise in order to make everything that little bit easier. I mean, come on. The Lord never said it would be easy to follow him. And a big part of that is that if we're to live in obedience to Scripture, then the real test of that obedience is whether or not we're submitting to the bits in the Bible that we find difficult, the bits very hard, maybe the bits that we really, really struggle with. That is the test of discipleship. And so, hey, that's the naked truth of God's word. Whatever it is, that is what we are about. Absolutely no BS. No biblical selectivity. Well, what did you think I meant? Anyway, look, there aren't any verses in the Bible that can drive you crazy. But what can drive you crazy is the way that Christians abuse and misuse certain verses. The verses are fine, but the way that Christians twist and distort them to their own ends is not always a good thing. And this is real part and parcel of, to see what the Bible teaches and the full force of it. Now then, I'm just going to read one of the most abused verses in the Bible. It's in Matthew, it's Jesus speaking, and it's this: "Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way that you judge others, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you." Now, when I first got to know the Lord, okay, I mean, yeah, I was as raw as it could possibly get, but I knew Jesus. I'd been set free, and I was full of him. It just, I just couldn't stop. And I'd go along to my local church and I'd mix in, I'd be going to the Bible studies and all the services. And I just had so many questions. And, sort of the Bible studies, they'd be going through certain passages. And I very quickly picked up on all the bits that were being avoided. And, and so, hey, yeah, I had questions and, probably they were raw and probably, sort of a bit, sort of like, the sort of stuff that sadly most Christians don't even want to confront. And one of the things that I was told again and again and again is that it's wrong to judge. You mustn't judge, Beresford. It's wrong to judge. And of course, any time one raised a question or spoke an opinion that didn't go down, that didn't suit, oh, you mustn't judge. Now, obviously, eventually, I kind of fell in, because not only is it disingenuous, it's actually, I mean, it's a whole new level of stupid, isn't it? Because if you think about it, someone makes a comment, they comment on something, they come up with an opinion, you don't like it, and so, hey, you mustn't judge. And it's a slap down. It's how to shut down debate. It's how to shut down people saying things you don't want to hear. But of course, here's why it's so daft. Because the point is they're saying it's wrong for you to judge. Well, there's the stupidity. It's wrong for you to judge, but it's okay for them to say that you're wrong for making that judgment. So can you see, the whole craziness of this "you mustn't judge." It's crazy, because the moment you say to someone, no, you mustn't judge, you are judging them. So it's really important that we understand what the Bible says about this. And of course, the point is that if we go on to read the rest of what Jesus said here, he said, "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own?" He's not saying that there might not be something in a brother that needs to be called out, pointed out, corrected. Okay. He says, "How can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' when all the time there's a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the plank out of your own eye, And then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. So clearly, Jesus is not saying you must not judge, full stop. No, he's saying here you mustn't judge hypocritically. It's completely wrong to make a judgment on others of something that you are yourself guilty of. That is just absolute hypocrisy. Okay, and it's interesting because when he talks about the speck in your brother's eye and the plank in your own, I mean that's really powerful, because of course what it's saying is that, okay, let's say I want to make a judgment on someone for something that I'm guilty of. Okay, well, what Jesus is saying here, as far as we're concerned ourselves, we must always consider our sin to be so much bigger than other people's sin. Because otherwise it just shows a completely wrong self-righteous attitude. So the whole point is, even if it is, occasionally legitimate to correct, and it is, the Bible does talk about correcting each other, but the whole point is that correction should be absolutely, it's the last resort, not the first. And I've said to people again and again and again, if you find it easy to correct people, you're probably doing it way too much. It should be difficult. It should be done in great humility, because how can you correct someone else, for some sin in their life they haven't put right, when we're aware of, the sinfulness of our own lives. So the point is that even though, as we're going to see, there is a time to judge and to actually carry out that judgment, nevertheless, we must always make sure that our attitude is that our default is to, as it were, minimize other people's sin and maximise our own, i.e. to always come at it so we know, hey, look, I am so sinful, so therefore if there's ever to be any judging, any correction that I need to do, my goodness, I just need to be so careful of my own attitude and come at people's specks, realising, oh man, the log, the plank in one's own eye. So what Jesus is dealing with here, it's a matter of attitude, because as Christians we can be all self-righteous and holier than thou. I mean, it's always pretty horrible when that happens, but all of us can fall into that, and we have to guard ourselves against it all the time. So hey, yeah, when one is making judgments and assessments about what other people are getting up to, okay, fine, but let's make sure that we're not doing it hypocritically. And if there's ever a time for us to actually voice such judgments to other people, that it's absolutely legitimate that we're doing so, that we're not doing it out self-righteous, and we're not doing it firing from the hip, that it's absolutely last resort, not first. Okay, so yeah, we got to make sure no self-righteous hypocritical judgment. But of course what we're seeing here is that obviously it's not Jesus saying Christians should never judge at all. It's obviously dealing with the thing that there's a right and a wrong way to do it. But of course, it raises a question as well, that what are we to judge? I.e., so what we're saying here is that what sort of things would it be legitimate for one Christian to say to another, I think you're wrong and you need to put that right? What's the basis for that? Now, we've dealt with attitude. It's got to be done in the right attitude. But even with the right attitude, we've got to kind of know, well, what are we entitled to correct each other about? Okay, what exactly is it legitimate to make judgments on other people concerning? Now, Paul deals with this very, very blatantly in various places. But for instance, in 1 Corinthians 5, He's describing to the church there that they're falling down on the whole thing about church discipline against believers in unrepentant sin. Now, again, immediately when we talk about church discipline, when we sort of talk about some people phrase it excommunication or disfellowshipping someone. Basically, it's when you refuse to fellowship with a believer in blatant, willful, unrepentant sin. And, Jesus, in his own teaching, he said, well, look, firstly, you go to the person individually. If you don't get any joy, you bring other witnesses in. And obviously they need to establish maybe you're in the wrong, not the other person. Maybe there's nothing to see here after all. But ultimately, you take it to the church. Now notice, not to church leaders, take it to the church. And again, we got to immediately come back here. Churches were totally different in the New Testament than they are now. So there are various teachings and instructions that we have in the New Testament to churches, which unbiblical churches can't carry out because by definition they're not like the churches were then. So if you've got a church of 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 people, well, how can you, take that to the church? I mean, how can that number of people, it's just crazy because remember, in the New Testament, churches like little extended families. They met in houses. It kind of capped the numbers. They weren't numerically big. There were numerically lots of churches, but the churches themselves individually were numerically small. Therefore, sort of church discipline meant something. You could say to someone, well, you're in sin. We cannot allow you to be partaking in our church gatherings, and particularly in the Lord's Supper, until such time as you've repented. And in 1 Corinthians 5, Paul is actually castigating the church there because there was someone who should have been excommunicated or put out the church, and they hadn't done so. And so Paul is addressing that. But what we need to see here is that in 1 Corinthians 5 verse 9, he says, look, I've written to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people. Not at all meaning the people of this world who are immoral or swindlers, idolaters, greedy. In that case, you'd have to leave this world. But now I am writing to you that you must not associate with anyone who calls himself a brother, but is sexually immoral or greedy, an idolater, a slanderer, a drunkard, a swindler, etc., etc. With such a man, do not even eat. And obviously that's ramifications for the Lord's Supper, which remember in the churches in the New Testament, when churches were biblical in the sense of based on the teaching of the apostles who got all their teaching from Jesus, then, the heart of a church gathering on the Lord's Day was they ate a meal together. They shared a meal together, the Lord's Supper. And then Paul goes on to say, what business is it of mine to judge those outside the church? Are you not to judge those inside? God will judge those outside. Now, before I come on to the bit that relates to us directly as Christians in judgment, just notice here that Paul says it's not our concern to be judging unbelievers. This is something that I think if more Christians understood, they'd maybe find it easier. I mean, I've known so many Christians through the years, they hide away from unbelievers. They wouldn't be seen dead talking to someone who was maybe gay or trans or covered in tattoos and, smoking a joint or something like that, or, sort of like, a lady of the night or something. They, like the Pharisees, steer well clear and all that. No, Paul says, no, we're not to judge unbelievers. That's why it's fine. We don't have, in our friendships and relationships with unbelievers, we're not here to be correcting them for their individual sins. We're to love them, accept them just as they are, because the Lord does, but to be waiting and praying for any such time, if you're an evangelist, if you've got that gift proactively, or if you haven't got that gift, then be ready if they ask to then we can tell them about the Lord and about repentance. But not this, I can't hang out with them because of this, that, or the other. You see, we're not to judge those outside, okay? So, I mean, sort of if you can't have good friendships with unbelievers, I think probably there's something amiss. You need to look at that. But the point is, what Paul is saying, you can't judge those outside the church, but we precisely do judge those inside the church. Now, later on in Corinthians, Paul establishes another principle, and it's to do with the love feast. And he says it's important that as believers we judge ourselves. So again, we got to come back. We got to be much hotter on judging ourselves than we are judging other people. No question about that. Our prime responsibility is dealing with our sin, not other people's sins. All right. So, yeah, we're to judge ourselves far more readily than we would ever dare judge anybody else. But it's absolutely clear here that Paul is saying that we are to judge those inside the church, i.e., we are to judge other believers. So, therefore, in fellowship together, and as I say, this should always be a last resort, there is a role for correcting one and holding each other to account. But what I want to make absolutely clear here is that Paul is talking here about things that are absolute black and white, chapter and verse sins. Black and white, chapter and verse sins. So in order for us to make a judgment about something, if sort of say in the sense of, do I need to try and, help this brother to, see that maybe that what they're doing there is wrong. As I say, real ginger and build the relationship first. Don't go in all guns blazing or anything like that. And the moment you see something that needs correcting, bang straight in there. Not at all, not at all. So often you can just win people just through the quality of relationship with them. Okay, but the point is, that in order to know, is this legitimate to be corrected, it's got to be something that is blatantly black and white, chapter and verse. So it's no use, we're going to come on in a minute and see the kind of things that Paul says we precisely must not judge one another, okay? But we're seeing here there is a mutual holding each other, as it were, to account. And it's interesting, that, when the Bible talks about correcting one another, Ginger, like going on about this, there are some people, man, it's like their hobby is correcting people. I'm obviously in all my travels and that, I obviously, sort of like come across and relate to sort of probably, many more Christians than, someone who's not in ministry is going to. And I've met Christians who have kind of, over say the course of a weekend, they've corrected me more than people back home I'm really close to have done in 10 years. They're looking for stuff to correct. I cannot tell you how horrible that is, and there are so many. I call them serial correctors. Oh man, it's terrible, most unpleasant. Okay, but the point is that there is this mutual accountability. Interesting, that Israel, under the Mosaic law, remember that, that old covenant, the Old Testament, it was their constitution as a nation. And it's just interesting, they didn't have a police force. They policed themselves. And that's interesting. Again, it's not down to leaders, to be doing all this. When the Bible talks about correcting one another, it doesn't leave the elders out. It doesn't leave apostles out. It doesn't leave, sort of evangelists, teachers. It doesn't leave them out because there are no tiers. Leadership is functional. So therefore, correct one another. It's not, the leaders correcting the plebs. This is something, there's a mutuality in it. But here is the point. If we are to judge, if we are to be at the point where we do, sort of like however lovingly and graciously try to, get a brother or a sister to see that there's something that's wrong, that they need to put right, then it's got to be absolute chapter and verse stuff. Okay. So now let's see what Paul says elsewhere. So we've seen Jesus saying that judgment mustn't be hypocritical. It's got to be fair, it's got to be just, and it's got to be done with the right attitude, sinner to sinner. And really that attitude is worse sinner to a lesser of a sinner. My log versus other people's plank. That's what keeps us in the right attitude, all right, towards other people. That's what humility is going to look like when it comes to our attitude towards the failings of others. So we've seen Jesus' judgment. He doesn't forbid it, but he says it must be done properly. in the right attitude. Now we've seen Paul saying, and judgment, it must be black and white stuff, stuff that is unarguably sin, chapter and verse. But now listen to what Paul says here. And he's writing to the Romans, the church there. He says, therefore, let us stop passing judgment on one another. Well, in Corinthians, he says, we ought to be, as it were, passing judgment on one another. And now he's saying, stop passing judgment on one another. Instead, make up your mind not to put any stumbling block or obstacle in your brother's way. So now he's saying the exact opposite. What he's not, what he is, but it's a different context. Because 1 Corinthians chapter 5, we saw the context there is absolute black and white chapter and verse sin. But the context here is, like at the beginning of this chapter 14, okay, he says, accept him whose faith is weak without passing judgment on disputable matters. One man's faith allows him to eat everything, but another man whose faith is weak eats only vegetables. The man who eats everything must not look down on him who does not, and the man who does not eat everything must not condemn the man who does, for God has accepted him. Who are you to judge someone else's servant? And then he goes on, one man considers one day more sacred than another man considers every day alike. Every man should be fully convinced in his own mind. Each one should be, he who regards one day as special does so to the Lord. He who eats meat eats to the Lord, for he gives thanks to the Lord. And he who abstains does so to the Lord and gives thanks to God. Now what Paul is dealing with here, he's dealing with issues that cannot be established as being moral sin, chapter and verse. He's talking here about matters of conscience, and he's talking here about things that are not, as it were, directly chapter and verse commanded one way or the other in Scripture. Okay, so what Paul is saying here, I mean, if you got a brother, sort of being immoral with his girlfriend, or you've got someone in the church and you know that they're stealing at work, bang, that requires action. Of course it does. But there are lots and lots of other things where the key is simply live and let live. Matters of conscience. And the big rule is none of us have the right to impose our conscience on other people's. Our responsibility is I must be true to my conscience, and if I'm not, that automatically becomes sin for me. But I have absolutely no right to try and impose my conscience upon you. As I say, we're dealing here with things, they're not black and white chapter and verse moral sins, okay? And obviously there are so many examples here. I mean, Paul talks about diet. You're free. Your diet is up to you. You can be a meat eater, you carnivore, you can be a vegetarian, you can be vegan. These are things, we accommodate one another on these things. We don't pass judgments. People with special days. Some Christians, they certain days, there are Christians, they're Sabbatarians. I'm not a Sabbatarian. I do not believe that there is any longer a Sabbath, all right? I mean, every day is a Sabbath. That's my understanding. But if someone wants to make what they see as the Sabbath day special, then who am I to say that they can't do that? You see the point? They shouldn't be having a go at me because I'm not Sabbath observing. I shouldn't be having a go at them that they are. It's entirely down to them. But of course, this can widen out into so many other things that Christians manage to fall out about, where they Christians who they find it so hard to let live and let live. I mean, obviously there are some. I mean, the problem with a lot of Christians is they don't care what you do; they'll still fellowship with you. They don't care if you're living with your girlfriend. They'll they'll fellowship with you at church, and let's get the band up there and have the knees up. And I have known through the years so many situations, and I'm talking about Bible-believing evangelical churches where Bible-believing evangelical Christians are in that church and they're living with their girlfriend, or in all manner of kinds of sin, in gay sexual relationships, and people are just, oh no, love, grace, that's all they go on about. So obviously, yeah, I'm not saying about, that we just allow black and white, chapter and verse sin. I've already covered that. Paul says, no, we hold each other to account on that sort of stuff. But I'm talking about here on matters of conscience. I mean, drinking, okay. I mean, there are lots of Christians who think that drinking is wrong. So it's absolutely incumbent on them that they do not drink alcohol. If they believe that that would be wrong for them to drink alcohol, drinking alcohol becomes sin to them. But if someone else, if their conscience is clear, then fine. We're not talking drunkenness. That would come into, the 1 Corinthians chapter 5 thing. If someone's getting drunk, hey, we got to help them stop getting drunk, bring them to repentance. But it's not like teetotal or falling down drunk. There's this spectrum. And so therefore, again, it's important that, the Christians who do imbibe, okay, don't have a problem with those who don't. And hey, if you're going to have someone round for dinner and you know that they're teetotal, well, unless they have specifically said, look, no, you go ahead, have a glass of wine, I really don't care. But until such point as you've actually absolutely got that guarantee, don't put drink out. And and if you're going to someone else's house and they've got you round for meal and you know that they don't drink, well, don't turn up with a bottle of wine or something. It's live and it's let live in these regards. Smoking. I mean, for so long as a Christian, I couldn't quit smoking. But I don't see. I mean, to this day, I can't see that smoking is a sin or anything like that. My goodness. And even if people say, well, addiction. Well, hang on. Coffee, tea. How many Christians do you know who are addicted to Mars bars and stuff like that? So again, we've just got to be careful here, okay? And certainly, whilst I was still smoking, I got reactions from some Christians that were worse than if they just discovered I wasn't living in sin with a woman somewhere. Oh my goodness. And, so it's what I'm saying, if it's not absolute chapter and verse, yeah, you can say to someone, oh, hang on, okay, sort of like you invite them round for dinner and they smoke. It's fine to say we don't have smoking in the house. But hey, if they really need a cigarette, well, go and sit with them outside in the garden. If it's raining, put an umbrella up and sit there while they have their cigarette. There's this kind of, can you see? It's tough when it comes to black and white chapter and verse sin, but when it comes to anything else, well, this is tolerance. This is live and let live. We're not free to be judging one another on these things. I've known Christians who refused to fellowship with other Christians when they saw Harry Potter books on their bookshelf. Now, if you think that reading Harry Potter is a great abomination, don't read Harry Potter. But don't break away. Don't refuse to have fellowship with other Christians who do. Or whatever. Anyone who knows me, I'm a sci-fi nut. I'm a Star Trek man. And I'm perfectly aware that there are Christians out there who believe that science fiction, that it's wrong. That they see it almost as a sideways step from occultism. Well, the whole point is, if I'm in relationship, or if I'm having to do with someone or people who believe that is wrong, well, I'm not going to be waxing eloquent, about the latest reruns of Star Trek, am I? But quite the same, it would be completely wrong for them to come into my home, sort of see a Star Trek Blu-ray and start rebuking me. Do you see the point? There are so many things that are matters of conscience, and the rule in regards to us as individuals is that we must live consistently with our conscience. All right. James says, if a man knows what is right but doesn't do it, that to him is sin. So therefore, if my conscience is that I believe something is wrong. Now, obviously, I believe that getting drunk is wrong. I believe that stealing is wrong. This is black and white chapter and verse stuff. Okay. But the point is, if there are things that I can't do, I believe it's wrong. Okay. If I was to do those things, then to me that would be sin. But I have absolutely no right to try and impose that on other people and to say that them doing it or whatever it is sin. If it's not black and white, chapter and verse, then obviously the rule is that we live by our consciences, but we don't make judgments on others for matters of conscience. So, hey, to judge or not to judge. And, as always, there are always, you can fall off a log two sides, can't you? And, there are Christians who are, and I would, at some point, we'll do a talk about legalism and license. We'll define that and understand exactly what is legalism, how to avoid it, exactly what is license or licentiousness and how to avoid that. But there are Christians that they don't make any judgment at all because anything goes. And so presumably, if they just happy being absolutely lax on what other Christians are doing that they know, however sinful it might be, I can only conclude it's because they're very, very lax in their own life. So, hey, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. I won't hold you to account, you don't hold me to account. So there's that side, the licentiousness. We don't make judgments on anything. Even the stuff we should be holding each other accountable for. But then on the other side, there are the legalistic Christians. They want thou shalt not drink up there with thou shalt not commit adultery. They want thou shalt not smoke up there with thou shalt not steal. They want that, thou shalt not read Harry Potter up there with, thou shalt not, defraud your neighbour or, whatever it is. And this is to entirely misunderstand the teaching of the New Testament. So from Jesus, we get absolutely directly that you must only make legitimate judgments in the right attitude. So even if the judgment is legitimate, black and white, chapter and verse, blah, blah, blah. If you're doing it in the wrong attitude, you are more wrong than whatever the sin is that you're wanting to correct in someone else. Because you're just being a complete hypocrite. So Jesus is saying that even legitimate judgment has got to be done with the right attitude. And we see from Paul, and remember that, any of the New Testament we're reading that isn't the quoting Jesus, well, it's the teaching that Jesus has passed on to the apostles. So this is all Jesus' teaching. So from Paul, we've seen that when it comes to black and white, chapter and verse, moral sin, we are to judge. We are to hold each other to account. But when it comes to anything that isn't black and white, chapter and verse, moral sin, we live and let live. We live and let live. Be cool. Be cool. Don't get all in the tiswas about what other people are doing. Look, they'll answer to the Lord. I've got to get on with my relationship with the Lord. Okay, that's the important thing. So hope that kind of makes that a little bit clearer. You never know. Yes, of course. Before I forget, all the flim flam, hit that subscribe button. Hit that like button and, of course, hit the bell and you'll always be notified of, sort of like when the next episode or another episode comes out. And, hey, let me hear from you, those good old comments and stuff like that. Be gentle with me, of course. Hey, have a wonderful day.